Hello, welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 10 Star Trek crossover episodes. In this video, I'll be counting down my personal top 10 favorite episodes that features a crossover between characters from other Star Trek shows. So this is a patron requested video, requested by patron Kyrie091. Kyrie091 gave me his list of favorite crossover episodes. So I'll read that first of all. Number 5, Caretaker. Quark's exchange with Kim was great and true to those characters. Kim is timid, Paris is pompous. 4, the TNG with Spock. 3, the DS9 with Riker. Stupid, fun fan service, and I love it. 2, we'll always have Tom Paris, LD. And 1, LD finale to Paul, Lily, etc. So, TNG episodes with Spock is Unification. The DS9 episode with Riker is Defiant. And Lower Decks is actually the penultimate episode, not the finale, with the Paul and Lily. That was called Fissure Quest. So anyway, I will have rules for my top 10 crossover, what I consider crossover episode. And unfortunately, my rules are slightly different than Kyrie091's because I'm only including episodes where the crossover character or characters in question appear throughout the episode and not just one scene. So unfortunately, Caretaker would be excluded from my definition because that's Quark only appears in that one scene. And that would also exclude stuff like McCoy's appearance in Encounter at Farpoint and other like random Lower Decks cameos like Q popping up and stuff like that. It has to be more than just one scene. It has to be an entire episode. Also, as I'm determining this countdown, I'm going by looking at the crossover specifically and not the episode as a whole. And so I may rank them a little bit differently if I was looking at the episode as a whole, but I am looking specifically at the crossovers. And I'm also not including characters who become either reoccurring or main characters in the show later, such as, Barclay appearing in Voyager because he becomes a reoccurring character, and sure, there's other examples. I'm also not counting anything in Star Trek Picard. I've ruled out Picard entirely because I really feel like all the TNG cameos are not really crossovers because Picard is essentially an extension of Next Generation. I know the showrunners and Patrick Stewart initially said that they didn't want it to be an extension of Next Generation, but by season 3, let's be honest with ourselves, that is what it became. And as much I really wanted to include the episode Nepenthe on this list because I love that episode, and by all counts it was originally just a guest star with Riker, but Riker becomes a main cast member in season 3, so I didn't feel right including that. In fact, I'm not really including anything from Picard, as I said, because most of the cameos are like I also wanted to do that Ro episode where she appeared, but again, she's a TNG character, and this is essentially a TNG extension of TNG, so I don't think anything. And they have some, like the Tuvok thing was just, again, one scene, so that's just a brief cameo. And 7 of 9 became a recurring character or main cast member, so that doesn't count either. So, yeah, Picard was completely excluded for me. Also, I'm excluding like recast of legacy characters such as Strange New Worlds, like having Kirk and Scotty and played by younger actors showing up. I'm not really counting that. I'm counting, and plus Strange New Worlds is kind of a take off of TOS anyway, but even if it wasn't, like, I don't know, I'm not counting like recasting younger actors to play like older legacy characters. That's not that's not really in the spirit of this list, I don't think. Crossover is more of getting the actor to play the original character, is what I'm thinking of. And also not counting, like, Pike and Spock appearing on Discovery, because, Strange New Worlds is essentially a spinoff of Discovery, and that's where it began. So that's not really a crossover. So yeah, so lots of rules for me, but that's just how I'm defining. And in my definition, I came up with 21 episodes. So we'll get into my top 10, my 10 favorite out of those 21. So before I count down my top 10, I do want to mention a few honorable mentions that didn't quite make the list. First honorable mention is Pathfinder. And yes, I am counting that. I just said I wouldn't count Barclay and Voyager, but Troi also appears in this episode. And yes, Troi also appears later on, but that's just one other episode, a brief appearance. I think it's the Inside Man. But plus, this is like, even though Barclay becomes the main character, this is clearly like a crossover episode. Like, very clearly, it was about these two TNG characters, and I think it was a good one. Next honorable mention is Dr. Bashir, I presume. I still consider Louis Zimmerman a Voyager character, even though he wasn't technically a main cast member. He was mentioned several times. He appeared in like some hallucinations, and then later in like a year from this episode, he seemed to have aged 30 years within the span of a year, and he did appear on Voyager. But still, it's Robert Picardo doing his best Doctor impersonation. So come on, it's a fucking crossover. Now, Tuvok in the episode, what was it, the Mirror Universe one in season 3? That doesn't count because that's just, again, that's kind of a brief cameo. He's not like a main character. But this one, yeah, the episode's about Robert Picardo. So yeah, this is definitely a crossover episode. As much as I hate the genetically engineered thing, as I said, I'm not judging this episode for that in this countdown. I'm judging it for the crossover, and for the crossover, actually kind of good. Kind of liked it. So next final honorable mention is Old Friends, New Planets. That is the season 4 finale of Star Trek Lower Decks, for those not aware. This is the one with Nick Locarno. This guy sucks. And yeah, I'm counting Nick Locarno as a crossover for sure. Definitely he is, even though he only appeared in one episode. And it brings back a legacy actor, obviously. I didn't, unlike Kyrie 091, I didn't include We'll Always Have Tom Paris, because that I thought was kind of a lame, because Tom Paris didn't really do anything. He just like, oh look, it's Tom Paris, and at the end he's the one who saw Boimler looking dirty. He's like, okay's on, like, which is so stupid. So that actually wasn't a good crossover. This is actually the better crossover that used Robert Duncan McNeil, and it also, again, it wouldn't count because it's just in one scene, but still, what's-his-face, Nick Locarno is the main crossover, so that counts. But in one scene, we did get Will Wheaton as Wesley and Shannon Phil, who had quit acting to reprise her and was brought back out of retirement to reprise her role as Ensign Cito, or Cadet Cito in this particular instance. So, and that was amazing. And overall, it was a really good episode. Good use of these crossover characters. So now we'll get into my top 10 favorite crossover episodes of the Star Trek franchise. We'll start with my number 10, which is Emissary. Now, unlike Caretaker, which only had one scene of Quark and therefore doesn't count, Emissary, the premiere episode of DS9, did have Picard as the main feature of this episode. He did appear in several scenes. He was a driving force. He also appeared as Locutus and many of the weird, like, prophet scenes with the wormhole aliens. And he was a presence, like, because Sisko was aggravated with him and blamed him for his wife's death. And so it was a good use of Picard, even though I'm kind of wasn't a big fan of the fact that they made it wasn't a good way to introduce the lead of the show by making them making him hate a character that we love is probably not the best way to introduce a character. But on his own self, on his own merits, it was a good use of Picard. And I wish they would have brought him back for another DS9 episode. But anyway, we'll get to my number 9, which is Birthright Part 1. And speaking of TNG DS9 crossover, and this one happened not too long after, you get a TNG episode where Bashir comes on board. Now, granted, Bashir, Season 1 Bashir is not a good character. He was very annoying at this stage. But I thought this was a good use of Bashir. And it was very interesting seeing him paired with Data. And he was actually a really good force for Data. The fact that he was more interested in mundane things about Data that most people didn't give a shit about. And that sort of camaraderie. And then Bashir helping Data make sense out of his new dreaming program. Like, that was good. That was a really good crossover. Really good use of Bashir there. But yeah, also Quark's appearance in Firstborn also doesn't count because that's just one scene. So unfortunately, that's not going to be on this list either. But Bashir definitely counts because he was throughout this episode. So yeah, that was a good use of him. Anyway, we will get to my number 8, which is Fully Dilated. Again, Lower Decks. Not the last time we will see Lower Decks on this list. It does have some of the best crossovers, I dare say. And this is a very good use of Data. Now, I love this episode, but again, I'm only looking at the crossover aspect of it. It might have been higher in my list if I was looking at the episode as a whole, like, Mariner playing the flute and saying, "I'm trying to get the inner light." But that's not what I'm judging about this. I'm strictly judging the Data thing. So we get alternate version of Data from a purple Enterprise in Data's head, and he becomes a mentor to Tendi. That's a good relationship, and I love their interactions. And Brent Spiner returns to voice Data, and we get some really funny lines and interactions between Data and Mariner and Data and Tendi, and it was great. It was a great use of Data. Absolutely loved it. So yeah. Next, we'll get into my number 7, which is Star Trek Generations. And yes, I am definitely counting this as a crossover. You could say this is partly a TOS and partly a TNG movie, but no, it's clearly a TNG movie. They just have an opening scene with the TOS characters, and we get the biggest crossover probably in the entire franchise, with the two captains, Kirk and Picard. Now, I gotta be honest, the Kirk and Picard stuff is my least favorite aspect of this movie. I think the other storyline with just the TNG characters is more interesting than once they meet up, all they do is attack Soren, and it's kind of boring. But we get some really interesting interactions with Kirk and Picard and the Nexus, and Picard trying to convince Kirk to leave. He has his fantasy, everything that he ever wanted in his entire life finally came true, and Picard has to convince him to leave it behind. And it was really actually strong stuff. It was actually a good interaction between these two characters. It was great seeing the two epic captains meet and compare and contrast. So yeah, I do have to give it a shout out for that. So next, we'll get into my number 6, again keeping the theme with classic TOS characters appearing on Next Generation, and that is Unification, parts 1 and 2, or mainly just part 2 actually, because Spock only appears in 10 seconds, although you get Sarek in the earlier part of part 1 as well. But anyway, it's mainly that part 2, but you could say both parts. Yeah, so again, this isn't the best episode. It had some goofy shit with Sela and the Romulans going, and the Riker subplot was complete and giant waste of time. But the crossover aspect of it actually did really work. It was really great seeing the chemistry that Spock and Picard have, and you also had a great scene with Spock and Data comparing, contrasting how they're kind of two sides of the same coin, which is very fascinating. It was a very great, gratifying scene to have. But more than that, the Picard and Spock, like the ways Picard almost came off as more like, emotionless than Spock did. I love the way they played with that, and the way that the two finally saw eye to eye, and it ended with Spock mind melding with Picard in order to experience what he experienced with Sarek, so he could be close to his father through Picard. That was great. It was overall, really impressed with unification. So next we'll get into number 5, which is Defiant, the whole Riker on DS9. Now granted, this is Tom Riker, not William Riker. This is Commander Riker's duplicate, who joined the Maquis, and that was obviously a plot convenience to get him to be the enemy of this episode, but or the villain. But they didn't play too much into the evil twin trope, though, and I thought it was a good use of Thomas Riker, and it was fascinating seeing his interactions with Kira, and it was kind of cool seeing Riker romance Kira, even if it was Tom and not William. But I definitely enjoyable crossover there. Always good seeing Jonathan Frakes. So next we'll get into my number 4, talking about Lower Decks once again, Fisher Quest. Yeah, this is the episode Kyrie091 mentioned, the penultimate episode of the entire show, where we get many cameos aplenty, or crossovers aplenty, I should say, because they're throughout their main characters throughout this episode, so it's not just quick cameos. We get a whole bunch of Harry Kims. We get Garrick and a EMH version of Bashir, who are a married couple. And most of all, we get T'Pol from Enterprise reprising her role. Now, these are all alternate universe versions of these characters, not the actual characters, but still definitely qualifies in terms of, and seeing them interact with, William Boimler. Speaking of transporter duplicates, it's Boimler, Bradford. What's his name? Bradford or Bradward or something like that. Anyway, it's his transporter duplicate, along with an alternate version, universe version of Mariner, and things. But basically, you get Lower Decks characters interacting with DS9 characters, Voyager characters, and Enterprise characters, and they also had Curzon Dax in there as well. So and Lily, of course, from First Contact. That one I wasn't a big fan of, but still, whatever. You had all these characters interaction, and it actually really worked. It was really fascinating, and it was great what they did with T'Pol. Most of all, I didn't like what they did with Harry Kim, making him a villain. That was kind of stupid. But what are they called? Bashirik or Guerrier? I can't remember what they're calling it. But Bashir and Garrick couple, that was amazing. That was that's worth it just then. So, we'll get into my number 3 crossover episodes, and that is Trials and Tribulations. Now, if you heard me talk about this episode before on my channel, you no doubt heard me call this the singular most overrated episode of the entire franchise. When I did my top 10 overrated episodes, this is clearly my number 1. I stand by that. I am not detracting that. But that is judging the episode as a whole. And because this deserves to be nowhere in contention to a top 20 best episodes, maybe even top 50 best episodes of DS9, because this is not, by any way, shape, or form, one of the best episodes of Deep Space Nine. But as I said, I am not looking at the episode as a whole for this countdown. I am looking specifically at the crossover. And as a crossover, it was actually really good. It was actually great use of using old footage and integrating the DS9 characters into the old footage of Tribbles. The way they did it was seamless. It was fascinating. It was so great seeing Captain Kirk dressed down, Miles O'Brien, and Bashir wandering around the original, and it's the 60s Enterprise setting and stuff like that. So, and then Cisco going up to Kirk and telling him how much he admired him. Like, that was great. You gotta admire it. It was a great, like, crossover, tribute to TOS episode. And I will say, that it was a good tribute episode, but tribute episode should not be considered one of the best episodes of Deep Space Nine, period. But that, again, that's another topic. Alright, so next we'll get into my number 2 second favorite crossover of the Star Trek franchise. And yes, again, getting back to Lower Decks, Hear All, Trust Nothing. It's not just because I'm a DS9 fan, and DS9 is my favorite Star Trek show, but that does have a lot to do. But it was just so gratifying to actually, seeing alternate universe versions of Bashir and Garrick being married was wonderful, and I won't downplay that. But for me, it was even better actually seeing Deep Space Nine, like Prime Universe, our Deep Space Nine, in the future. Canon, it's canon now that this is a future version of Deep Space Nine that's beyond the show. We see Kira is still there, and she's like old friends with Shax, and they keep arguing over who saved their lives more than the other, which was so great. It was so perfect. It was so beautiful. And then we get Quark returning, and Quark being himself and setting up franchises throughout the galaxy, and just their interactions with Captain Freeman and the other Lower Deck characters, and seeing our Lower Deckers wandering around with DS9 Lower Deckers, and it was just so great. And it was a good episode on top of that. It was just so heartfelt and had great emotional impact, and it was such a good use of a crossover. It was so perfect. It was definitely one of my favorites. So number 2 on my list is Hear All, Trust Nothing. And so next we will get into my number 1 favorite crossover Star Trek episode. And once again, mentioning Lower Decks, however, this time it's not a Lower Decks episode. It's our Lower Deckers crossovering over into Strange New Worlds. That's right, my number 1 is these old, or is it those or these? I think it's these or those. I think it's those. Those old scientists from season 2 of Strange New Worlds. Yeah, some people might disagree with me because these are 2 modern Trek shows crossing over with each other and not more classic or legacy Trek, but that doesn't really concern me. What concerns me is that this was a perfect crossover episode. It was so beautiful. The fact that they brought in Lower Decks characters from an animated show, but had the actors reprise the roles in live action, and how you get a glimpse of seeing the actors play them in live action, just how perfect it was. And it had that intro that was animated. That took place in the Lower Decks timeline, but when they cross over to the past, they go into live action. Like that was just perfect. And then it has the Strange New World cast animated at the end of the show when they like drink this drink that makes them all like drugged up or whatever. It was perfect, but it was such a good episode because it managed to be hilarious. It managed to integrate like these Lower Deckers and the way they throw out references to all the Star Trek things very fast, and how that just goes over the heads. But the way these characters integrate is like perfect. But on top of that, they use this crossover to tell a powerful emotional story. And it's like the most emotionally powerful episode of the season is a crossover with these cartoon characters who are goofy and over the top silly, and there's comedy everywhere, but yet they still manage to use that goofiness to tell such a powerful story, and they fit it into the overall arc of the season like so perfectly. This is by far, I think, the most impressive use of a crossover. Even though, yes, it is 2 modern Trek shows crossing over, it's just perfect. It's just a beautiful episode overall. So that is my number 1 crossover, Those Old Scientists. So that is it for my top 10 Star Trek crossovers. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you, Kyrie091, for requesting this video. And of course, if you would like to request videos like this, or maybe get other perks, such as Patreon-only videos where I revisit reviews I've only done, you could consider supporting me on Patreon. Link will be in the description below for that. And yeah, be sure to check out my channel as I continue to cover Star Trek Next Generation and Star Trek Deep Space Nine, 1 episode at a time. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.